Good evening. Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious side of medicine. Forget the Hollywood versions of strung-out artists and desperate street corners. This story begins not in the shadows, but in the gleaming laboratories of the world's most trusted pharmaceutical companies. The truth is, presented with its promise, you, like millions of others, would have called it a miracle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's step into tonight's journey together. Before there was a molecule, or a name, or a syringe, there was a flower, a deceptively simple thing. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bearing poppy. It stands a few feet high, its stem a pale waxy green, almost blue in the haze of a summer afternoon. At its top sits the flower, a delicate cup of petals, sometimes white, sometimes a blushing pink or a deep bruised purple. They're as thin as parchment, and they flutter in the slightest breeze. But the petals are not the prize. After they fall away, they leave behind the pod, a small crowned globe, a seed head that swells with the promise of new life. And something more. Inside this globe, a network of fine vessels carries a milky white latex, a bitter sap. For millennia, this was humanity's most profound and intimate relationship with a plant. The story begins here, in this sap. It begins in the soft, fertile earth between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. In the long, slow dawn of civilization, the Sumerians cultivated these fields of nodding flowers. They knew the secret of the pod. With a small, sharp knife, they would make a shallow, careful incision in its skin. Almost immediately, the white milk would begin to weep, beading on the surface like tears. Left in the sun, it would thicken and darken, turning into a sticky, brownish gum. This was opium, raw and unrefined. They had a name for this plant, a name that tells you everything you need to know about their relationship with it. They called it Hull Gil, the joy plant. They pressed it into tablets and prescribed it for all manner of ailments, from intractable coughs to the deep, gut-wrenching pains of dysentery. But its greatest gift was oblivion, a gentle, painless slide into sleep, away from the troubles of a harsh and unforgiving world. The knowledge of the joy plant was precious, a piece of divine technology passed down from healer to healer. From Mesopotamia it began to travel. It moved with the caravans, a small dark brick of solace tucked into saddlebags, traded for copper, for timber, for textiles. It made its way to the great empires of the Nile. In Egypt, the poppy found a new and fervent following. Physicians, who were also priests, administered opium with a reverence usually reserved for the gods. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, dating back to around 1550 BC, contains remedies using opium. It was prescribed to soothe crying children, a practice that would echo with terrifying consequences thousands of years in the future. It was used in elaborate religious rituals, a key to unlock the doorways of the mind. The poppy was so integral to their culture that it was buried with pharaohs, a final comfort for their long journey into the afterlife. The trade routes broadened. Phoenician sailors, the great merchants of the ancient world, carried opium in their ships across the Mediterranean. They took it to Carthage, to Spain, and most importantly to Greece. Here, in the cradle of Western thought, opium was not just a medicine. It was woven into the very fabric of mythology and philosophy. The Greeks associated the poppy with gods of sleep and dreams, like Hypnos and Morpheus. It was also linked to Thanatos, the god of death, a recognition of its dual nature. It could bring gentle sleep, but too much could bring a sleep from which one never woke. They understood the razor's edge. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, dismissed the magical thinking surrounding illness, but he did not dismiss opium. He praised its utility as a painkiller and a styptic, an agent to stop bleeding. He codified its use, lending it a new air of scientific respectability. By the time the Roman Empire rose to dominate the known world, opium was perhaps the most widely used and effective drug in the physician's arsenal. The city of Rome itself was a massive consumer. The legions marched with it. Doctors carried it to treat the wounds of the battlefield. In the teeming city, street vendors sold it alongside bread and wine. The most famous physician of the Roman era, Galen of Pergamon, was a true believer. He saw opium as a near panacea, a cure for everything from headaches and epilepsy to snake bites and melancholy. He famously included it in his legendary cure-all concoction, theriac, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients that was the gold standard of Roman medicine. Galen's writings would be preserved and studied for the next 1,500 years, and with them, the unimpeachable reputation of opium. It was quite simply the mother of all medicines. For centuries this was the state of affairs. The dark gum of the poppy was a constant, a reliable friend in a world of pain. Its power was undeniable, but also unpredictable. The potency of one batch of opium could vary wildly from the next, depending on the soil, the weather, the time of harvest. A dose that brought relief one day might be fatal the next. It was a powerful but blunt instrument. Medicine was an art, not a science, and the use of opium was its highest and most dangerous expression. But the world was changing. The age of alchemy was giving way to the age of chemistry. In the flickering gaslight of the early 19th century, a new kind of mind was beginning to ask a new kind of question. It wasn't enough to know that opium worked. They wanted to know why. They wanted to dismantle the joy plant piece by piece and find the engine of its power. They wanted to isolate its soul. And in a small, quiet town in Germany, a young and determined pharmacist's apprentice was about to do just that. He would give that soul a name, and in doing so he would change the world forever. The age of the plant was ending. The age of the molecule was about to begin. His name was Friedrich Serturner. He was a young man, barely into his 20s, working as an assistant in a pharmacy in Paderborn, a small city in Westphalia. He was not a celebrated professor or a wealthy industrialist. He was simply curious and possessed of a dangerous degree of persistence. Night after night, after the pharmacy had closed and the streets grew quiet, Serturner would work in his modest laboratory. He was obsessed with opium. He was convinced that the raw, sticky gum was a cocktail of different substances, and that one of them, one single active ingredient, was responsible for its profound effects. He called this hypothetical substance the principium somniferum, the sleep-inducing principle. His quest was to capture it. The work was painstaking, tedious, and fraught with risk. Using the crude tools of early chemistry, beakers, flasks, and alcohol burners, he began a process of systematic chemical assault on raw opium. He dissolved the dark gum in acid, then neutralized it with ammonia. This caused a substance to precipitate out of the solution, forming tiny greyish-yellow crystals. He had isolated something, but what was it? He tested his new compound on stray dogs and mice. The results were dramatic. The animals would fall into a deep, profound sleep, a slumber so still it mimicked death. When they awoke, they seemed unharmed. This, he believed, was it. This was the pure essence of opium's power. But to be certain, to truly prove its effect on humans, he needed human subjects. So in 1817, in an act of scientific bravery that bordered on madness, he recruited 3 of his friends, each of them a young man about his own age, and he made himself the first test subject. He carefully measured out a dose of the crystals for himself and his friends. It was a tiny amount, just half a grain, about 30 milligrams. They swallowed the bitter powder. 30 minutes passed. Nothing. Serturner, feeling a mixture of disappointment and perhaps a little foolishness, decided to double the dose. He administered a full grain to each of them. This time the effect was unmistakable. A warmth spread through their limbs, a leaden heaviness that was both pleasant and overpowering. Their heads grew thick, their thoughts slowed to a crawl. But Serturner wasn't satisfied. He pushed further. He administered a 3rd dose. The effects became violent. Nausea, vertigo and a crushing headache set in. One of his friends collapsed into a stupor so deep he was unresponsive. Ser Turner, realizing he had gone too far, that he was teetering on the very edge of poisoning his friends and himself, had to act. He administered a powerful emetic, a dose of vinegar, to induce vomiting and purge their systems of the substance. They all survived, groggy and ill, but alive. The experiment was a success. He had found it. He had isolated the first active alkaloid ever to be extracted from a plant. He named his creation Morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, a fitting tribute to the ancient power he had now tamed and concentrated. Later, the name would be standardized to morphine. The discovery was, at first, largely ignored. Ser Turner was an unknown from a provincial town, but eventually the implications of his work began to ripple through the scientific community. The French chemist Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac recognized the genius of the discovery, and soon pharmaceutical companies like Merck in Germany began producing morphine commercially. The impact on medicine was revolutionary. For the first time, doctors had a painkiller of known and consistent purity. They could administer it with precision. A dose of morphine was the same in London as it was in Paris or Vienna. It was 10 times more potent than raw opium, a concentrated and reliable weapon against pain. It transformed surgery from an agonizing ordeal of butchery into a survivable procedure. It gave relief to cancer patients, to sufferers of neuralgia, to anyone in the grip of extreme unbearable pain. It seemed like a pure, unalloyed miracle. But this miracle had a dark twin, and a new piece of technology was about to unleash it on a scale the world had never seen. In the 1850s, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood and a French surgeon named Charles Pravaz independently developed the hypodermic syringe. It consisted of a hollow needle attached to a plunger. For the first time, a drug could be delivered directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the slow and inefficient route of the digestive system. The effect was instantaneous and immensely powerful. The marriage of pure morphine and the hypodermic needle was a turning point in history. It created a method of delivering relief that was faster, more intense, and more efficient than anything that had come before, and it arrived just in time for a war. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, was a conflict of unprecedented industrial scale and brutality. The weapons were new and terrible. The mini-ball, a soft lead bullet, shattered bone and tore through flesh in a way that made amputation the most common surgical procedure. The battlefields were scenes of unimaginable carnage. The field hospitals were even worse. Overwhelmed surgeons worked in blood-soaked tents, with little understanding of sanitation and an endless line of screaming, wounded men. Pain was the enemy as much as the opposing army, and the army's medical corps had 2 invaluable tools in its arsenal: chloroform for anesthesia and morphine for the brutal, lingering pain that came after. Morphine was distributed on a massive scale. The Union Army alone purchased millions of opium pills and tens of thousands of ounces of morphine powder. It was administered liberally, often by exhausted and undertrained medics. It was a blessing. It saved countless men from dying of shock and agony. It allowed them to endure the unendurable. But when the war ended in 1865, and the soldiers who survived returned home, they brought a new affliction with them. They were missing limbs, their bodies were scarred, their minds haunted by what they had seen and done. And for many of them, there was another, more insidious wound, a deep, gnawing craving for the medicine that had gotten them through the war. They had left the battlefield, but they could not leave behind the needle and the little bottle of morphine solution. The condition became so common it was given a name: the soldier's disease. It was the first modern epidemic of iatrogenic or physician-caused addiction. These men, once celebrated as heroes, were now often seen as moral failures, their morphinism a private shame. They were the first generation to discover the terrible paradox of Ser Turner's creation. The cure for pain could create a suffering all its own, a prison with walls made of pure relief. Medicine had solved one problem, the wild, unpredictable nature of opium, only to create a new and more terrifying one. The search was now on for a solution. The world needed a painkiller with all the power of morphine, but without its dreadful curse of addiction. The world needed a safer alternative. And in the gleaming, state-of-the-art laboratories of a rising German chemical giant, a team of scientists believed they were on the verge of creating it. They were looking for a hero. The setting for our next scene is not an ancient field or a makeshift war hospital, but a place of gleaming modernity and industrial ambition. It is Elberfeld, Germany, in the last years of the 19th century, and the protagonist is not a single man but a corporation, Friedrich Bayer and Company. Bayer was a titan of industry, a chemical powerhouse that had built its fortune not on medicine, but on colour. They were masters of synthetic dyes, pulling brilliant blues and vibrant reds from the black, sticky waste of coal tar. Their success was built on rigorous research, a deep faith in chemistry, and a keen sense of the market. Having conquered the world of textiles, they turned their formidable research and development apparatus towards a new, even more lucrative frontier, pharmaceuticals. In 1897, their new pharmaceutical division had already produced a spectacular success. They had taken a folk remedy, salicylic acid from willow bark, which was effective against fever and pain but brutally harsh on the stomach, and chemically modified it to create acetyl salicylic acid. It was a gentler, more effective version of the original. They would soon market it to the world under a new trade name, aspirin. It was a triumph of industrial chemistry, a model for how to improve upon nature. And the head of Bayer's pharmacology lab, a confident and ambitious professor named Heinrich Dresser, was eager to apply this model to another, more challenging problem. The problem was morphine. By the 1890s, the soldier's disease was no longer just a problem for veterans. Morphine addiction was a widespread social ill, affecting people from all walks of life, often those who had been prescribed the drug for chronic conditions. It was a medical nightmare and a public relations disaster for the pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, there was a desperate need for effective respiratory medicines. Tuberculosis, bronchitis, and pneumonia were rampant killers, and their primary symptom was a deep, racking and persistent cough. This cough exhausted patients, prevented them from sleeping, and hastened their decline. The best available cough suppressant or antitussive was codeine. Codeine was another alkaloid found in opium, much milder than morphine and thought to be less addictive. But its weakness was its defining trait. It often wasn't strong enough to quell the violent coughing fits associated with serious lung disease. Morphine, on the other hand, was an excellent cough suppressant. It worked by depressing the cough centre in the brainstem, but it had that terrible side effect. It also depressed the respiratory centre right next to it. In the weak, frail patients who needed it most, a dose of morphine strong enough to stop their cough could also be strong enough to stop their breathing altogether. And then, of course, there was the addiction. This was the challenge Professor Dresser set for his team. He wanted a new drug, a drug with the cough-suppressing power of morphine, but without its dangerous tendency to shut down the lungs. And most importantly, he wanted a drug that was not addictive. He believed it was possible to chemically separate the good effects of morphine from the bad. He wanted to create a safe morphine. The task of synthesizing this new wonder drug fell to a young chemist in his laboratory named Felix Hoffmann. Hoffmann was a talented and methodical chemist, the very same man who just 11 days earlier had successfully synthesized the stable, marketable form of aspirin. He was on a roll. His method was the same one he'd used to create aspirin from salicylic acid, acetylation. It was a standard chemical technique, attaching an acetyl group to a molecule to change its properties. Hoffmann took pure morphine, derived from Bayer's vast supplies of opium, and boiled it with a chemical called acetic anhydride. It was a straightforward, if noxious, process. The result was a new molecule, a fine white crystalline powder. The chemical name was diacetyl morphine. 2 acetyl groups had been attached to the morphine molecule. Hoffmann had done his job, he had created the substance. Now it was up to Heinrich Dresser to figure out what it could do. Dresser began testing the new compound. which he codenamed heroin, in his laboratory. He started with animals, mice, guinea pigs, and rabbits. The results were immediately encouraging. It was a remarkably powerful respiratory suppressant. It calmed the breathing of the animals far more effectively than codeine. Crucially, in the doses he was testing, it did not seem to cause the dangerous level of respiratory depression that morphine did. It appeared at first glance to be safer. The next step was human trials. These were not the rigorous double-blind, placebo-controlled studies we would expect today. Dreser and his team began by testing the drug on themselves, their assistants, and then on workers in the Bayer factory who were suffering from coughs. The reports were glowing. The substance was astonishingly effective. A very small dose could stop a persistent cough in its tracks, allowing for a peaceful night's sleep. But there was another effect, a side effect that was noted with great interest. The subjects reported a feeling of pleasant euphoria. It made them feel good. They felt strong, clear-headed, and full of energy. One report noted that the drug produced a sense of heroism. This observation lit a fire in Dreser's marketing-savvy mind. He saw the name. This was a heroic drug, one that would conquer disease and suffering. He officially named the substance heroin, from the German word heroisch. But he didn't just see it as a cough suppressant, he saw a much grander, more audacious application. Based on his flawed and limited observations, Dreser became convinced that heroin was not addictive. In fact, he theorized that it could be the cure for morphine addiction. His reasoning was a tragic leap of faith. He believed that heroin satisfied the physical craving for an opiate without producing the same soporific, stupefying effects of morphine. He imagined that a morphine addict could be switched to heroin, and then, because heroin was supposedly non-addictive, they could simply be weaned off it with little to no discomfort. He had found the Holy Grail, a non-addictive morphine substitute that could also cure morphine addiction. It was the perfect product. In November of 1898, Heinrich Dreser presented his findings to the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians. He extolled the virtues of his new discovery. He declared it to be 10 times more effective as a cough suppressant than codeine, but with only a fraction of the side effects of morphine. He positioned it as a wonder drug, a testament to the power of German science and Bayer's industrial prowess. The medical community was captivated. Bayer immediately launched a massive international marketing campaign. They sent free samples of heroin to thousands of doctors across Europe and the United States. They published articles in medical journals praising its efficacy for treating not just coughs but asthma, tuberculosis, and even whooping cough in children. It was sold as a liquid, in tablets and in flavoured glycerin elixirs to make it palatable for the young. It was advertised as the safe, non-addictive alternative. The hero had arrived to save the world from the tyranny of respiratory disease and the scourge of morphine addiction. The deception, born of a mixture of wishful thinking, flawed science, and commercial ambition, was complete. The world, desperate for a miracle, was ready to believe, and so the trap was set. Bayer began producing heroin by the ton, shipping its little bottles of white powder to every corner of the globe, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, that they were not curing an epidemic, but preparing to unleash a plague. The story of a wonder drug often begins not with a bang, but with a cough. A dry, hacking, persistent cough, the kind that rattled the rib cages of a world still haunted by the spectre of tuberculosis, pneumonia, and bronchitis. It was in this world, at the very cusp of the 20th century, that the German chemical giant Friedrich Bayer and Company found itself holding what it believed to be a miracle. They had a new compound, diacetyl morphine, synthesized by their chemist Felix Hoffmann in a diligent, if ultimately fateful, attempt to create a less addictive version of codeine. The initial tests conducted on the workers within the Bayer factory in Elberfeld were astonishing. It was reported to be 10 times more effective as a painkiller than morphine, and, as a cough suppressant, it was simply without peer. More importantly, the company's head pharmacologist, Heinrich Dreser, declared with the unshakable confidence of late Victorian science that it was free from the hypnotic, habit-forming qualities of its parent compound. A safer morphine, a better codeine, a perfect medicine. All it needed was a name, the company, searching for a brand that could capture the substance's powerful, invigorating effect, looked to its own test subjects. They reported feeling a profound sense of well-being, a surge of strength and confidence. They felt, in a word, heroic. And so, from the German word heroisch, a brand was born. Heroin. It was a name that sounded strong, modern, and utterly benign. It sounded like a solution. Bayer, a company that had built its reputation on meticulous science and was on the verge of global domination with another of its recent products, aspirin, threw its entire industrial and marketing might behind this new wonder drug. The campaign was a masterpiece of global commerce. It was aggressive, it was comprehensive, and it was breathtakingly successful. From 1898 onwards, a flood of promotional materials poured out of Germany and into the mailbags of physicians, pharmacists, and hospitals across the civilized world. Free samples were dispatched by the tens of thousands, arriving in neat little packages in doctors' offices from London to St. Louis, from Vienna to Shanghai. The bottles themselves were works of quiet medicinal elegance. Small clear glass containers filled with a fine white crystalline powder, sealed with a cork and adorned with the now iconic Bayer cross logo. The label, in crisp black print, declared its contents. Heroin. For those who preferred convenience, it was pressed into tablets. For the most common affliction, the cough, it was suspended in a sweet glycerin-based elixir, making it palatable even for children. Advertisements bloomed in the pages of the world's most respected medical journals. One striking ad from the era shows the name heroin in bold Art Nouveau lettering, surrounded by a litany of ailments it promised to vanquish. Coughs, bronchitis, phthisis, asthma, whooping cough. Another, featuring the Bayer logo, simply stated, heroin, the sedative for coughs. The company presented it not as a narcotic, but as a specific therapeutic agent, a tool of precision medicine. It didn't just mask a cough, it cured the irritation that caused it. It didn't just dull the pain of childbirth, it eased the process. Most astonishingly, and with an irony so profound it would become the stuff of tragedy, Bayer marketed heroin as a cure for addiction itself. It was promoted as a non-addictive substance that could be used to wean patients off their dependence on morphine or codeine. Doctors, desperate for a solution to the growing problem of iatrogenic opioid addiction, a problem created by the widespread use of medicines from the previous generation, embraced this claim with desperate relief. Here at last was the exit ramp, a way to treat pain and suffering without creating a new prison for the patient. And so heroin entered the public sphere not through the back alleys, but through the front door of the pharmacy. It was sold over the counter, without a prescription, in nearly every country it reached. A person suffering from a cold could walk into a chemist shop in Paris and purchase a bottle of heroin hydrochloride as easily as they could buy soap. A mother in rural America could order a Bayer heroin-based cough syrup for her child through a mail-order catalogue. It was just another proprietary medicine, another weapon in the household arsenal against everyday illness. It sat in medicine cabinets next to the iodine and the aspirin, a small unassuming bottle containing a substance of almost unimaginable power, its heroic name a testament to the world's boundless faith in a better life through chemistry. For a few short, heady years, it seemed that Bayer had truly delivered a cure for the world's cough, a balm for its pain, and a solution to its addictions. The little white powder was everywhere, a quiet, ubiquitous presence promising relief in every bottle. The world, it seemed, had found its hero. The first threads of the Great Deception began to unravel not in grand pronouncements from prestigious medical bodies, but in the quiet, worried correspondence of ordinary doctors. They began as whispers, as scattered anecdotes from the front lines of medicine. A physician in Philadelphia wrote a short letter to a medical journal in 1900, noting with a tone of clinical curiosity that several of his tuberculosis patients, whom he had placed on heroin to control their coughs, seemed to require ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect. More troublingly, when they attempted to cease the medication, they were afflicted with a peculiar and severe form of uneasiness. A pharmacist in Boston noticed that certain customers were returning for Bayer's cough elixir with an alarming frequency, their colds apparently lasting for months on end. They were pale, thin, and agitated if he happened to be out of stock. In France, doctors treating morphine addicts with the new cure observed a disturbing phenomenon. Their patients did indeed stop using morphine, but they simply transferred their devotion to the heroin with a frosty that was startling. They called this new state heroinism, and it appeared to be a far more ravenous and intractable condition than the one it was meant to replace. These were the early signals, the first tremors before the earthquake. For a time they were dismissed. Bayer, when confronted with these reports, confidently assured the medical community that these were isolated cases, likely due to improper administration or the psychological disposition of the patients themselves. The drug, they insisted, was non-habituating. Their research was conclusive, and for a while the world believed them. The drug was simply too effective, the relief it provided too profound for doctors to abandon it based on a few scattered reports. The alternative was to go back to the weaker, more obviously addictive codeine or the dreaded morphine. But the threads kept unravelling, and soon the whispers grew into a chorus of alarm. The central catastrophic flaw in Bayer's miracle was a simple matter of biochemistry, one that had been tragically overlooked in their initial research. Diacetylmorphine, heroin, was, in essence, a delivery system. Its two acetyl groups made it more fat-soluble than morphine, allowing it to cross the blood-brain barrier with stunning speed and efficiency. Once inside the brain, the body's enzymes quickly stripped those acetyl groups away, converting the compound back into morphine. The user was not experiencing a new, non-addictive substance. They were experiencing a supercharged dose of morphine, delivered directly to the brain's opioid receptors with a speed that produced a far more intense and immediate euphoria. This rapid onset was the key to both its perceived effectiveness and its devastatingly addictive power. It created a cycle of reinforcement that was far more potent than that of its slower-acting parent. The concept of tolerance began to fill the pages of medical literature. Doctors described how a patient who once found relief from a single 5 mg tablet now required 10, then 20. The cough was long gone, but the need for the medicine remained, now transformed into a gnawing physical imperative. And with tolerance came the true horror: withdrawal. The uneasiness described in those early letters was given a more detailed and terrifying vocabulary. It was a complete systemic collapse. Doctors chronicled the symptoms with a kind of horrified detachment: uncontrollable yawning, streaming eyes and nose, profuse sweating followed by chills and gooseflesh, a symptom that gave rise to the chillingly descriptive slang cold turkey. Then came the muscle cramps, the vomiting, the diarrhea, the insomnia, the overwhelming anxiety and despair. It was the agony of morphine withdrawal, but many physicians reported that it was faster in onset and, subjectively at least, far more severe. The body, deprived of the substance it had been rewired to expect, was screaming in every possible way. The deception was now laid bare. The heroic cure for morphine addiction was not only addictive itself, it was by some estimates 2 to 3 times more potent and created a dependency that was significantly harder to break. The free samples that Bayer had so generously distributed had acted as a vast, uncontrolled clinical trial, and the results were pouring in. Sanatoriums and asylums, once filled with alcoholics and morphine addicts, began to report a new class of patient, the heroin habitué. These were not, at first, shadowy figures from the underworld. They were teachers, clerks, housewives and labourers, ordinary people who had been prescribed a cough suppressant and had walked into a chemical trap from which there was no easy escape. The very doctors who had championed the drug were now faced with the monumental task of undoing the damage they had unwittingly caused. The medicine cabinet, once a source of comfort and relief, had for thousands become a cage. By 1905, the American Medical Association had removed heroin from its list of accepted medicines. striking its name from the new and non-official remedies. The medical community, once the drug's greatest advocate, was beginning to turn its back on the fallen hero. The deception had unravelled completely, leaving behind a trail of broken dependencies and a problem that was about to spill out of the clinics and onto the streets. The shift from medicine to menace was not instantaneous. It was a slow, curdling process that took place in the first decade and a half of the new century. As respectable physicians grew wary and then outright hostile towards heroin, a profound change occurred in how and by whom it was used. The drug, having lost its medical legitimacy, did not simply disappear. Instead, it began a downward migration, slipping out of the sanitized world of the pharmacy and into the murky, unregulated spaces of urban life. The user base began to transform. The middle-class patient with a cough was replaced by a new clientele. Disillusioned soldiers returning from the Spanish-American War, labourers in sprawling industrial cities, petty criminals, prostitutes, and the denizens of urban vice districts. These were people living on the margins, for whom the drug's potent euphoric oblivion was not a side effect to be managed, but its primary appeal. The method of consumption also evolved. The era of the sweet medicinal elixir was over. The new users bought the powder, which was now being manufactured by less scrupulous chemical firms or diverted from legitimate supplies. They discovered that its effects were more potent if it wasn't swallowed, but sniffed. Sniffing parties became a feature of the bohemian and underworld scenes in cities like New York. Soon after, the most efficient and dangerous method of all was popularized: injection. The hypodermic syringe, a recent medical innovation, became the tool that sealed the drug's reputation. It allowed for the most direct and powerful administration, but it also brought with it the new horrors of abscesses, infections, and the easy transmission of disease. Heroin was no longer a medicine. It was a jolt, a fix. Its identity was being forged anew in the shadows. This transformation coincided with a period of immense social anxiety in the United States. The progressive era was in full swing, a time of great reform, but also of great fear. Fear of rapid industrialization, of teeming cities, of new waves of immigrants from southern and eastern Europe, and of racial tensions. In this charged atmosphere, heroin addiction became more than a personal tragedy. It was framed as a social contagion, a threat to the very fabric of the nation. Newspapers, hungry for sensational stories, began to print lurid headlines about dope fiends and drug-crazed criminals. Heroin was linked in the public imagination with vice, crime, and foreignness. It was no longer a German miracle cure. It was an insidious poison corrupting America's youth and undermining its moral fibre. The addict, once seen as a patient, an unfortunate victim to be pitied and treated, was now recast as a dope fiend, a dangerous, morally weak deviant to be feared and punished. This moral panic created the perfect political climate for federal action. For decades, narcotics regulation had been a patchwork of inconsistent state and local laws. But now, a powerful movement for federal control was gaining momentum, driven by a coalition of reformers, diplomats, and law enforcement officials. A key figure in this push was Dr. Hamilton Wright, a zealous and ambitious physician who was appointed as the United States' first opium commissioner. Wright saw narcotics addiction not primarily as a medical issue, but as a moral and international one. He believed that America's domestic drug problem was a national disgrace that undermined its standing on the world stage, and he lobbied tirelessly for a federal law that would bring the trade under strict government control. His efforts, combined with international pressure from conferences at Shanghai and The Hague, paved the way for landmark legislation. The result was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, passed by Congress in December of 1914. On its surface, the act was not a prohibition law. It was a tax law, framed under the federal government's constitutional power to levy taxes. It required any person who imported, manufactured, sold, or distributed cocaine or opium-derived products, including heroin and morphine, to register with the federal government, pay a special tax, and use specific order forms. Physicians were permitted to prescribe the drugs, but only in the course of his professional practice only. And within that seemingly innocuous phrase lay a revolution. The crucial question became, what constituted legitimate professional practice? The law did not specify. The power of interpretation fell to the enforcers, specifically the Bureau of Internal Revenue within the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department, staffed by lawmen, not doctors, adopted a hardline punitive interpretation. They quickly decided that prescribing narcotics to an addict simply to maintain their habit was not a legitimate medical practice. It was merely catering to a vice. The consequences of this interpretation were immediate and catastrophic. Doctors who had been humanely maintaining their addicted patients on steady legal doses of heroin or morphine suddenly found themselves in legal jeopardy. A series of Supreme Court decisions in the years following the Harrison Act solidified the government's position, effectively criminalising the medical treatment of addiction. Thousands of physicians were harassed, arrested, and prosecuted. Fearing for their licenses and their liberty, the vast majority of American doctors simply stopped treating addicts altogether. They closed their doors to the very patients who needed them most. This single act, born of a mixture of good intentions and moral panic, fundamentally altered the landscape of addiction in America. It did not end heroin use. It merely ended its legal supply. The problem was wrenched from the hands of the medical community and thrown into the arms of the criminal justice system. With doctors out of the picture, the thousands of users who had been dependent on a legal, regulated supply were now desperate. They were sick, in withdrawal, and branded as criminals. Their only recourse was the street, and the street was ready. The Harrison Act, by choking off the legal supply, created the perfect conditions for a black market to flourish. The vacuum left by the physicians and pharmacists was filled by a new figure, the professional drug dealer. The price of heroin on the illicit market skyrocketed. The purity became dangerously unpredictable, cut with quinine, sugar, or worse. A public health crisis was officially transformed into a crime wave. The users, in order to pay the inflated prices for their now illegal medicine, were often driven to theft, prostitution, and other criminal activities. The law had not solved the problem of heroin addiction. It had created the modern American drug underworld. The little bottle that had once sat in the medicine cabinet was now gone. In its place stood the police officer, the jail cell, and the shadowy figure dealing a mystery powder in a back alley. The heroic cure, having deceived the world, was now officially a menace, banished to the very shadows it would help to define for the next century. The law, in its infinite and often misguided wisdom, had slammed the door shut. The Harrison Act, the various bans, the international conventions, they had declared the age of legal heroin over. But in the grand, drafty house of global commerce, another door, a back door, had just creaked open. A much more profitable one. Nature, especially the nature of commerce, abhors a vacuum. And the vacuum left by Bayer, by Merck, by the legions of physicians who had prescribed their miracle cure, was vast and deep and begging to be filled. Into this void stepped men who understood supply and demand better than any economist. Men who wore fedoras instead of lab coats, and who measured profit not in quarterly reports, but in kilos and body counts. The modern heroin trade, the one that would stain the rest of the 20th century, was not born in a boardroom. It was born on the sun-scorched poppy fields of the Anatolian Plateau in Turkey. For centuries, farmers there had cultivated Papaver somniferum, scraping the raw milky opium from its pods. Much of it was for the legal market, processed into morphine base for the world's hospitals. But a certain percentage, a quiet surplus, was always available for those with cash and a discreet disposition. The first link in a new invisible chain had been forged. From the fields of Turkey, the raw opium or the morphine base began its journey west. Its destination was a city of sea salt, garlic, and secrets. Marseille, Hunts's oldest city, bustling port on the Mediterranean, was the perfect crucible. It was home to the Corsican syndicates, the milieu. These were not flashy gangsters. They were clannish, ruthless, pragmatic men, dynasties of smugglers who had cut their teeth running contraband cigarettes and liquor. Men like Paul Carbone and Francois Spirito. They knew the shipping lanes, the customs officials who could be bought, the quiet coves where a boat could unload in the dead of night. They saw the potential immediately. This white powder was lighter than alcohol, more valuable than gold. So they built the laboratories, not in the city itself, but tucked away in the sleepy villas and farmhouses of Provence, in the rocky hills overlooking the Azure Sea. Here they employed the true wizards of this new trade, the chemists. Some were renegades, rogue talents from the legitimate pharmaceutical industry, men who knew the delicate dance of acetic anhydride and morphine base. They were artists of a dark science. They took the crude brown blocks of morphine base from Turkey and, through a precise and dangerous process, purified them. They washed and filtered, boiled and cooled, until they had precipitated a substance of extraordinary quality. It was not the beige or brown powder that would later become common. This was heroin number 4, fluffy, brilliant white, and often testing at 98% purity. It was the best in the world, and it would become known simply as the French Connection. The logistics were a masterpiece of criminal ingenuity. The finished product, packed into 1 kilo bags, had to cross the Atlantic. The methods were as varied as they were clever. It was hidden in the panels of a brand new Buick, shipped from a showroom in Paris to a buyer in New York. It was sewn into the lining of expensive luggage, carried by well-dressed couriers on transatlantic ocean liners like the SS Ile-de-France. It was secreted away in barrels of fish, in hollowed-out statues, in crates of French wine. The Corsicans were the manufacturers and exporters. They were brilliant at it, but they needed a distributor. They needed a partner on the other side of the ocean. They found one in the Italian-American mafia. After World War II, Charles Lucky Luciano, exiled in Italy but still pulling the strings of his criminal empire, saw the future. He and his associates in the 5 families of New York City controlled the docks. They controlled the unions. They controlled the trucking. They were the gatekeepers of America's largest city. A deal was struck. The Corsicans would deliver the product and the mafia would handle everything else. They were the wholesalers, breaking down the multi-kilo shipments and selling them to mid-level dealers who, in turn, would sell them on the streets of New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. For decades, this pipeline was almost mythically efficient. It was a well-oiled international machine, a shadow corporation with its own supply chain, manufacturing division, and global distribution network. It turned a Turkish farmer's crop worth a few $100s into a product that would fetch millions on the streets of America. The quiet cough medicine, now an outlaw, had found its new corporate sponsors. They were far more dedicated and far more lethal than Bayer had ever been. The world had tried to cage a monster, and in doing so had handed the keys to the zookeepers of the underworld. They didn't just let the monster out. They fed it, strengthened it, and taught it how to hunt in every corner of the globe. And in a steamy, war-torn jungle half a world away, that monster was about to find an entirely new and tragically captive audience. The French Connection was a tidy if brutal business, a linear path from poppy to port to pavement. But history is rarely so neat. While the Corsicans perfected their European trade route, a far messier and more volatile situation was brewing in Southeast Asia. The region known as the Golden Triangle, the mountainous, lawless borderlands where Burma, Thailand and Laos converge, was, and had been for a very long time, the world's largest opium farm. Here, the trade wasn't controlled by a single disciplined organisation. It was a chaotic free-for-all of warlords, corrupt officials and insurgent armies, many of whom were secretly propped up by Cold War-era intelligence agencies, including the CIA, as a bulwark against communism. They paid for their armies with opium. It was the currency of the jungle. And then America went to war in that jungle, into this pre-existing super-saturated market for opiates. The United States deployed over 500,000 young men, soldiers, most of them teenagers, ripped from their homes and dropped into a world of incomprehensible heat, fear and boredom. The mission was confusing, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, and the days were long and punctuated by moments of sheer terror. It was a perfect storm. On one side, a massive localized supply of the purest heroin the world had ever seen, processed in mobile jungle labs. This was China White. And it was cheap. Dirt cheap. A vial containing 1/10 of a gram of 95% pure heroin could be bought on the streets of Saigon or at the perimeter of a firebase for $2. On the other side, an army of lonely, frightened and disillusioned young men. For them, heroin wasn't a party drug. It was medicine. It was an escape pod from a living nightmare. It made the heat bearable. It made the fear recede. It made the endless waiting disappear. A soldier could take a hit, and for a few hours the war would simply cease to exist. It was the ultimate anesthetic for the soul. Crucially, the method of ingestion was different. Back in the States, heroin meant needles. It meant mainlining. A taboo, a terrifying leap for a novice. But in Vietnam, the product was so pure it didn't need to be injected to deliver a powerful high. It could be smoked. It was often sprinkled into a cigarette or heated on a piece of tinfoil, the user inhaling the wisps of smoke through a tube. A practice known as chasing the dragon. This simple fact changed everything. It lowered the psychological barrier to entry to almost nothing. It was just smoking, no needles, no track marks, no shared equipment. It was clean, easy and discreet. One GI could try it, feel the blissful release and share it with his buddy. The contagion spread through platoons, through barracks, through entire divisions. It was an epidemic hiding in plain sight. The military command was slow to grasp the scale of the problem. At first, they saw it as an issue of discipline, a few bad apples. But by the late 1960s, the evidence was undeniable. Medics were treating overdoses. Officers were finding their men nodding off on guard duty. The whispers grew into a roar that eventually reached Washington, D.C. The numbers, when they were finally compiled, were staggering. A 1971 Department of Defense study estimated that 40,000 US servicemen in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. Some congressmen believed that as many as 15 to 20% of all enlisted men had used it. The White House panicked. President Richard Nixon saw a looming catastrophe. An army of trained, armed and addicted soldiers returning to American soil. It was framed not as a health crisis, but as a national security threat. An enemy infiltration. In June of 1971, Nixon gave a famous address in which he declared drug abuse public enemy number one. This was the official declaration of the war on drugs. Its first major campaign was called Operation Golden Flow. It was a simple, sweeping and desperate policy. Every single American soldier had to pass a urinalysis test before they could board the plane home. If they failed, they were forced to stay in Vietnam for detoxification. The program was riddled with problems. Soldiers found ways to cheat the tests. The detox centres were hastily set up and often brutal, but its primary effect was to formally identify thousands of addicted young men. They were no longer just soldiers, they were addicts, a label that would follow them home, and when they got home, their nightmare truly began. They returned not to parades, but to protests. They were reviled by many for their role in an unpopular war. And their drug of choice, the cheap, pure, smokable China White, did not exist in America. The heroin available on the streets of New York or Los Angeles was the French Connection product. It was expensive, often costing $50 a fix, and it was heavily diluted or stepped on with quinine, lactose or worse. Its purity was rarely more than 5 to 10%. It was far too weak to smoke. To get the same effect they had become accustomed to in the jungle, the returning veterans had only one choice. They had to pick up a needle. They became the new face of the American heroin addict. They were not jazz musicians or beatniks. They were the boys next door, the high school football stars who'd been sent to fight a war and had come back with a wound far deeper and more insidious than any piece of shrapnel. Their addiction, born in the trauma of combat, was now seen as a moral failing, a sign of weakness. They were shunned by the Veterans Administration, which was unequipped to handle this kind of problem. They were targeted by law enforcement. They found themselves adrift in the country they had been sent to defend, their private war continuing long after the last helicopter left the roof of the American embassy in Saigon. They were the seeds of a plague scattered by the winds of war into the fertile soil of a nation that was beginning to decay from the inside out. The returning veterans were a new stream feeding a growing river of addiction, and that river flowed directly into the heart of America's cities. The 1970s were a period of profound and painful transformation. The post-war boom was over. The nation was gripped by stagflation, an unnerving combination of economic stagnation and high inflation. The great industrial engines of the Northeast and Midwest began to sputter and die. Factories that had built the nation's cars, steel and appliances were shuttered, their gates chained, their windows broken. A massive wave of deindustrialization swept across the urban landscape. With the jobs went the people who could afford to leave. The phenomenon of white flight accelerated as middle-class families, both black and white, decamped for the promise of the suburbs. They left behind a hollowed-out urban core, a landscape of crumbling infrastructure, underfunded schools and diminishing hope. The tax base evaporated. City services withered. Landlords abandoned apartment buildings, which became magnets for crime and despair. Entire neighborhoods in places like the South Bronx, Harlem, Detroit and Newark began to resemble war zones. And in this ecosystem of decay, heroin found its perfect habitat. It was a simple, brutal equation. When the legal economy collapses, the illegal economy thrives. For a young man in a forgotten neighborhood with no job and no prospects, the drug trade offered one of the only paths to money, status and power. It became a twisted version of the American dream. The mafia, the old wholesalers of the French Connection, were still at the top of the pyramid. They were happy to sell to anyone who could move their product. But on the streets, a new kind of entrepreneur was emerging. In Harlem, a man named Leroy "Nicky" Barnes saw the opportunity. Barnes was brilliant, charismatic and utterly ruthless. He wasn't content to be a simple street dealer. He decided to organise the chaos. He travelled to Italy to deal directly with the mafia's suppliers. He created an organisation called the Council, a 7-man board of major black drug traffickers in New York City. They pooled their money, streamlined their distribution, handled their own legal affairs, and brutally eliminated their competition. They were in effect a Fortune 500 company of heroin distribution. Barnes became so powerful and so brazen that the New York Times magazine put him on its cover in 1877 with the headline, "Mr. Untouchable." He was a folk hero to some, a demon to others, but above all he was a creature of his environment, a symptom of a deeper disease. The product itself became a brand. No longer was it sold in anonymous little bags. Dealers began to stamp their glassine envelopes with logos and names, a form of street-level marketing to build a loyal customer base and signal the potency, or alleged potency, of the product inside. Names like DOA, Red Dragon, Poison, Death Wish, The Last Ride. This branding turned a commodity into a fetish object, an icon of the nihilism that had gripped these communities. Buying a bag of heroin was not just an economic transaction, it was a statement. The social fabric of these neighbourhoods was shredded. The heroin economy created a self-perpetuating cycle of destruction. Addiction fueled a massive spike in property crime. Mugging, burglaries, shoplifting as users scrambled to get the $50, then $100, then $200 a day they needed to support their habit. Abandoned buildings became shooting galleries, squalid, dangerous spaces where addicts could get high, hidden from the world. Families were torn apart. The generation of children who grew up in this environment, the crack babies of the subsequent decade, were born into a world where the nodding addict on the corner was as common a sight as the mailman. The violence was staggering. Turf wars erupted between rival gangs fighting over the most lucrative corners. The police, overwhelmed and often corrupt, waged a desperate losing battle. The justice system became a revolving door. For every dealer arrested, 10 more were ready to take his place. It was a blight that seemed to have no cure. By the end of the 1970s, The old guard was beginning to fall. The French connection was finally dismantled through the dogged work of American and French law enforcement. Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable, was finally touched, betrayed by one of his own council members and sentenced to life in prison. But it didn't matter. The machine they had helped build had become self-sustaining. The demand was now deeply entrenched. The infrastructure for distribution was in place. When the French supply line was cut, new suppliers from Mexico and the Golden Triangle eagerly stepped in. When Barnes was taken off the street, his lieutenants simply fought over his territory. The quiet little medicine from the Bayer laboratory had completed its long, strange journey. It had travelled from the pharmacy's shelf, through the corporate boardroom, across the fields of Turkey, into the secret labs of Marseille, over the Atlantic in the hulls of ships, through the jungles of Vietnam, and finally landed here, in the scarred and broken heart of the American city. It was no longer a miracle cure for a cough. It had become the lifeblood of a subterranean economy, a source of immense criminal wealth, and a symbol of profound social collapse. The non-addictive morphine substitute had found its final, most devoted congregation among the legions of the dispossessed, offering a fleeting moment of peace in a world that had offered them none. The war in Vietnam had a curious effect on the geography of desire. While American attention was fixed on the deltas and jungles, another conflict, a much quieter and more patient one, was being waged in the mountains to the north and west. Here, in the hazy blue-green highlands where Burma, Laos and Thailand converge, the earth itself was being weaponized. This was the Shan Plateau, a rugged, lawless expanse of nearly 100,000 square miles. A place of deep valleys and cloud-shrouded peaks, accessible only by mule train or, for the very fortunate, a precarious landing strip carved into a hillside. For centuries, its isolated ethnic groups had cultivated the opium poppy. It was a cash crop, a folk medicine, like a simple fact of agricultural life. But in the mid-20th century, this pastoral tradition was industrialized by ghosts of a forgotten war. When Mao Zedong's communists triumphed in China in 1949, the defeated remnants of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang army, the KMT, fled south. Thousands of these soldiers, cut off from their homeland, spilled over the border into the Shan states of Burma. They were an army without a country, but they were disciplined, well-armed and utterly pragmatic. They saw the poppies not as flowers, but as a source of revenue, a means to fund their long, slow dream of one day retaking the mainland. And so they set to work. The KMT organised the local poppy farmers, who were mostly from the Hmong and Shan ethnic groups, into a cohesive production network. They imposed a tax, payable in raw opium, and they protected the growers from the interference of the weak, newly independent Burmese government. They became the de facto rulers of this mountainous kingdom, their authority enforced by the barrel of a rifle. The logistics were formidable. The raw opium, a sticky dark gum scraped from the seed pods of the poppy, had to be transported from thousands of remote hillside plots. Mule caravans, sometimes hundreds of animals long, would snake through treacherous mountain passes guarded by KMT soldiers, their destination the border with Thailand. It was here, in makeshift labs hidden deep in the jungle, that the first stage of alchemy took place. The opium was boiled, treated with lime, and refined into a chalky, crumbly morphine base. Bricks of it, stamped with the KMT's official seal, 2 crossed flags, became the new currency of the highlands. But the world's appetite was changing. Morphine was not enough. The market demanded the purer, more potent and far more profitable diacetyl morphine. Heroin. The KMT initially lacked the chemical expertise. That arrived in the late 1950s and 60s as chemists from Shanghai and Hong Kong, fleeing communist rule themselves, were recruited into the mountains. They brought with them the knowledge of acetylation, the simple but crucial process of adding acetic anhydride to the morphine base. Suddenly the jungle labs could produce not just morphine, but kilos of pure white No. 4 heroin, the famous WO Globe brand, a product of unparalleled purity and a brand that became synonymous with the Golden Triangle's deadly efficiency. The scale of this operation is difficult to comprehend. By the early 70s, this region was producing an estimated 700 tons of raw opium per year, enough to supply the entire American market and much of Europe's. It was a state within a state, a narco-kingdom built on a flower. The Vietnam War raging to the east was both a catalyst and a cover. The Central Intelligence Agency, in its fervent anti-communist crusade, saw the KMT and other local militias as useful proxies against the Pathet Lao in Laos and the Viet Cong. The CIA's proprietary airline, Air America, a supposedly civilian carrier, flew supplies into the region's remote airstrips. The planes that brought in guns and ammunition did not always fly out empty. They often carried opium and heroin, a convenient backhaul that financed the agency's local allies. It was a perfect closed loop of pragmatism and plausible deniability. The war also created a new captive market. Stressed, demoralized and bored American soldiers in Vietnam found the high-purity heroin from across the border to be cheap, plentiful and a potent escape. Vials of pure white powder could be bought on the streets of Saigon for a few dollars. By the end of the war, an estimated 15% of returning GIs were addicted to heroin, a devastating legacy that poured back into the streets of America. And then there were the warlords. The KMT's dominance eventually fractured, giving rise to local figures who learned the trade and sought to control it for themselves. The most famous or infamous of these was a man named Chang Chi-fu, better known to the world by his nom de guerre, Kun Sa. A man of mixed Chinese and Shan heritage, he was a master of branding and political theatre. He styled himself not as a drug lord, but as a revolutionary, the leader of the Shan United Army, fighting for an independent Shan state. His war, of course, was funded entirely by heroin. At his peak in the 1980s, Kun Sa controlled an estimated 70% of the Golden Triangle's output. He commanded a private army of 20,000 men, complete with surface-to-air missiles. He built a massive fortified base at Homong, near the Thai border, that was a small city unto itself, with schools, a hospital, and even a holiday inn for visiting business associates. He would hold press conferences in the jungle surrounded by his troops, lecturing journalists on Shan nationalism while his caravans, protected by those same troops, moved vast quantities of heroin toward the coast. For decades, the Golden Triangle was a geopolitical black hole. It corrupted governments in Bangkok and Rangoon, financed decades of intractable civil war in Burma, and flooded the world with a seemingly endless river of white powder. It was a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of violence, politics, and chemistry, hidden in plain sight, blooming in the quiet solitude of the mountains. The heroin that left these hills would travel through a complex web of brokers in Thailand, pirates in the South China Sea, and couriers on commercial airliners. And as it flowed west, it would seep into the cultural bloodstream, eventually finding an unlikely and unsettling new expression, not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but under the harsh, sterile lights of a fashion photographer's studio. The shift was as subtle as a change in the weather. The glossy, vibrant, athletic bodies of the 1980s supermodels, the Cindy Crawfords, the Naomi Campbells, women who looked like goddesses of health and vitality, began to feel dated. A new decade, the 1990s, brought with it a different mood. A kind of weary cynicism, a post-Cold War ennui. It was the era of grunge music, of Generation X apathy, and the aesthetic of fashion began to reflect this cultural downshift. It started in the pages of avant-garde British magazines like The Face and ID, and it was championed by a new wave of photographers who rejected the polished artifice of their predecessors. They favoured a style that was raw, realistic, documentary-like. They shot in cheap apartments on grimy streets in drab, liminal spaces, and their subjects, their models, began to look different too. They were impossibly thin, almost skeletal. Their skin was pale, translucent. Their eyes were ringed with dark circles, their expressions vacant, their poses awkward, as if caught mid-stumble. It was a look of profound exhaustion, of alienation. A look that was, to anyone who had seen it up close, unmistakably the look of a heroin user. This was heroin chic. The term itself was a provocation, first appearing in the media in the mid-90s to describe this pervasive and troubling new trend. It was never an official marketing term, of course. No designer or magazine editor would ever have used it. But it perfectly captured the essence of the aesthetic they were selling. The undisputed face of this movement was a young, waifish model from Croydon, London, named Kate Moss. Her collaboration with the photographer Corinne Day for the British edition of Vogue in 1993 became the defining moment of the era. The photos, shot in Moss's own modest apartment, were stark and unglamorous. She wore simple underwear, her body was thin and unadorned, her gaze seemed lost. It was a world away from the sun-drenched beaches and couture gowns that usually filled the magazine's pages. This was beauty as fragility, as vulnerability, as a kind of beautiful damage, and it was revolutionary. It resonated with a generation tired of manufactured perfection. The look spread like wildfire through high fashion. Designers like Calvin Klein built entire campaigns around it, with black and white images of hollow-cheeked youths staring blankly from billboards. The androgyny of the models, the blurring of gender lines was part of the appeal. It rejected the overt, powerful sexuality of the 80s in favour of something more ambiguous and withdrawn. The message was one of retreat, of disengagement from a world that seemed overwhelming or meaningless. The clothing itself reflected this. Slip dresses that hung on bony frames like rags, oversized sweaters, drab colours, greys, beiges, blacks. It was fashion as a kind of stylish surrender. Music amplified the mood. The angst-ridden lyrics of Kurt Cobain, the dark, melancholic sound of bands like Portishead and Massive Attack provided the perfect soundtrack to this visual culture of decay. And of course, the connection was not merely aesthetic. Kurt Cobain's own struggles with heroin were public knowledge, lending a grim authenticity to the trend. Musicians, artists and actors, figures at the heart of popular culture, were dying from the drug, yet the image of addiction was being commodified, sanitized and sold back to the public as the pinnacle of cool. The Italian photographer David Sorrenti became another key figure, his work for magazines like Detour and Ray Gun, capturing the gritty, drug-fueled reality of youth culture in downtown New York. His photographs were intimate and unsettling, beautiful and disturbing. They weren't faking it. He and his friends were living the life they were documenting. The problem, of course, was the profound irresponsibility of it all. High fashion, a multi-billion-dollar industry that shapes global ideals of beauty and desire, was actively glamorizing the look of a terminal illness. It stripped the reality of addiction, the sickness, the desperation, the crime, the squalor, the overdoses, of all its horror, and presented only the superficial signifiers, the thinness, the pallor, the detached cool. It was a dangerous fantasy. It made a deadly drug seem romantic, poetic, a kind of tragic badge of honour for the sensitive and artistic soul. The backlash when it came was fierce. Public health officials, addiction specialists and parent groups were horrified. They saw the images for what they were, a reckless normalization of self-destruction. In May of 1997, President Bill Clinton gave a speech in which he directly condemned the fashion industry. The glorification of heroin is not creative, he declared. It is destructive, it is not beautiful, it all is ugly. And this is not about art. It is about life and death. The industry, which for years had deflected criticism by claiming artistic expression, was suddenly on the defensive. But the true turning point, the event that shattered the illusion, came earlier that same year. In February 1997, David Sorrenti, the brilliant young photographer who had so perfectly captured the heroin chic aesthetic, died. He was found in his New York apartment surrounded by heroin paraphernalia. His death was the result of a lifelong blood condition, exacerbated by his heroin use. He was only 20 years old. Sorrenti's death was a profound shock to the fashion world. It was a brutal intrusion of reality into their carefully constructed fantasy. It was no longer an abstract aesthetic, it was a dead young man. His mother, the photographer Francesca Sorrenti, launched a public campaign, Awareness, the David Sorrenti Appeal, to end the glamorization of drugs in fashion. The industry, shamed and sobered, began to retreat. Magazine editors issued statements promising a new focus on health and well-being. The model started to look a little healthier, a little less vacant. The lighting got a little brighter. The era of heroin chic was over, almost as quickly as it had begun, but it left a strange and lingering cultural residue. It had, for a moment, made the abyss look fashionable. It had packaged despair as a luxury good. And even as the fashion world turned its back on the imagery of the street junkie, far more dangerous and widespread opioid crisis was quietly gathering storm. Not in the gritty alleyways of the Lower East Side, but in the clean, respectable and carpeted offices of pharmaceutical companies. The next wave of addiction would not be whispered about in hushed tones. It would be prescribed by a doctor in a little orange bottle with a label that promised, with scientific certainty, that it was safe. The dawn of the 21st century felt for many like a time of medical miracles, and one of the most celebrated was the conquest of pain. For decades, the medical establishment had been deeply cautious about prescribing strong opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. The risk of addiction was considered too high, but in the mid-90s, a profound shift in thinking began, a shift that was not accidental, but was engineered with one of the most sophisticated and deceptive marketing campaigns in pharmaceutical history. The architects of this shift were a privately held company based in Stamford, Connecticut, called Purdue Pharma, owned by the secretive and immensely wealthy Sackler family. In 1996, Purdue launched a new drug called OxyContin. The active ingredient was oxycodone, a powerful semi-synthetic opioid that had been around for decades and was known to be highly addictive. But Purdue claimed their pill was different. It featured a patented time-release mechanism, a special coating called Contin that was designed to deliver the medication slowly over a 12-hour period. This, Purdue argued, smoothed out the peaks and valleys of a drug's effect, eliminating the euphoric rush that led to abuse and addiction. Their central marketing claim, a claim they pushed with relentless force, was that the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. It was a stunningly effective and utterly baseless piece of fiction. Purdue Pharma unleashed a marketing blitz of unprecedented scale and scope. They more than doubled their sales force, creating an army of representatives who targeted not specialists in pain management, but general practitioners, family doctors in small towns and rural areas across the country, the very doctors who saw the most patients with chronic pain from injuries, arthritis, and back problems. These sales reps were armed with misleading charts, biased studies funded by Purdue itself, and a simple, powerful message. Doctors were failing their patients by letting them suffer. A new concept was being promoted in the medical community, partly through Purdue's influence, that pain should be treated as the fifth vital sign, as important as blood pressure or heart rate. It was a compassionate idea on the surface, but it created immense pressure on doctors to eliminate pain at all costs. And Purdue was offering the perfect, easy solution. The incentives were enormous. Sales representatives received huge bonuses based on the volume of OxyContin prescribed by the doctors in their territory. Doctors, in turn, were showered with attention and perks. Purdue flew thousands of them to all-expenses-paid pain management seminars in sunny resorts in Florida and California, where they were treated to lavish meals and reassuring speeches from paid medical experts who downplayed the risks of addiction. They distributed branded fishing hats, coffee mugs, and even swing music CDs with titles like Get in the Swing with OxyContin. It was a comprehensive campaign to change the culture of medicine, to re-educate a generation of doctors and convince them that this powerful narcotic was a safe, non-addictive miracle. And it worked. Prescriptions for OxyContin skyrocketed. Sales grew from $48 million in its first year to over $1 billion just 4 years later. The drug was prescribed for everything from post-surgical pain to chronic backaches to fibromyalgia. Purdue specifically targeted areas with high rates of workplace injuries, places like Appalachia, the Rust Belt, and rural Maine, turning entire communities into epicenters of a burgeoning epidemic. The central lie, of course, was the time-release formula. It didn't take long for users to figure out that the entire dose of oxycodone could be released at once simply by crushing the pill and snorting the powder, or dissolving it in water and injecting it. This bypassed the time-release mechanism completely, delivering a massive heroin-like euphoric rush. The very feature that Purdue had advertised as a safeguard became a vector for abuse. The company was aware of this vulnerability from the very beginning, but this information was buried. Reports of widespread abuse, of pills being sold on the street for $1 per milligram, of pharmacies being robbed, began to surface across the country. But for years, Purdue deflected blame. They insisted the problem wasn't the drug, but the criminal abusers who were not using it as directed. They even invented and promoted the concept of pseudo-addiction, a dangerous theory suggesting that patients who exhibited signs of addiction, like clock watching for their next dose or demanding higher prescriptions, weren't actually addicted, but were merely suffering from undertreated pain. The solution, they argued, was to prescribe them even more opioids. A new generation of opioid-dependent people was being created, not in back alleys, but in doctors' offices. These were not stereotypical drug users. They were high school athletes given OxyContin for a football injury, construction workers for a bad back, suburban mothers for chronic migraines. They were people who followed their doctor's orders, who trusted the medical system. They became physically dependent on a legal prescribed medication. And then, inevitably, the supply would be cut off. A doctor would grow concerned and stop writing prescriptions. A patient would lose their health insurance. The cost of buying pills on the black market, where an 80-milligram pill could sell for $80, would become unsustainable. These people, now in the grips of a powerful physical addiction, faced a terrible choice. They could endure the agony of withdrawal and experience many describe as the worst sickness imaginable, or they could find a cheaper, more accessible alternative to feed their dependence. And that alternative was waiting for them on the street. It was heroin. The economics were brutal and simple. An $80 a day OxyContin habit could be replaced with a $10 or $20 a day heroin habit. The two drugs are molecular cousins, acting on the same opioid receptors in the brain. For a body dependent on oxycodone, heroin feels almost identical. It was a seamless and devastating transition. The prescription pipeline had become a conveyor belt, moving hundreds of thousands of Americans from the pharmacy to the street corner. The very epidemic that the fashion world had briefly glamorized and then disavowed in the 90s came roaring back, but this time it was different. It was bigger, it was more widespread, and its victims were more diverse. It was an epidemic born not of cultural trends, but of corporate greed and medical malpractice, a national tragedy delivered one prescription at a time. The miracle drug had deceived not just a few, but an entire world of patients and doctors, creating a void that only its illicit older sibling could fill. In the thin, high air of Afghanistan, after the fall of 2001, the world's most powerful militaries arrived with the best of intentions. They came to dismantle al-Qaeda, to topple the Taliban, and to build a new nation from the rubble of the old. And in the immediate aftermath of their arrival, it seemed a corner had been turned. The Taliban, in a final severe display of their authority in the year 2000, had declared the opium poppy un-Islamic. They enforced their decree with brutal efficiency. Fields were ploughed under, farmers were punished, and in a single growing season, the world's opium supply plummeted by over 90%. It was a stunning, albeit ruthless, act of supply-side interdiction. For a brief moment, it appeared as though one of the primary wellsprings of global heroin had simply been switched off. But the new order, brought in on the wings of cruise missiles and the boots of special forces, had a different set of priorities. The primary objective was stability. It was counter-terrorism. And stability, in the complex mosaic of Afghan tribal politics, meant making alliances. It meant winning hearts and minds. And the hearts and minds of millions of rural Afghans were tied inextricably to the humble, beautiful, and profoundly lucrative poppy. To eradicate the crop was to eradicate the livelihood of entire provinces. It was to create enemies where you desperately needed friends. And so a quiet, unspoken decision was made. The poppy fields, for the most part, would be left alone. Coalition commanders on the ground, tasked with fighting an insurgency, understood that a farmer whose field you burn today would be a man planting an improvised explosive device for you tomorrow. Warlords, many of whom were now our allies in the fight against the Taliban, were the very men who controlled the regional opium trade. To disrupt their business was to disrupt the fragile alliances holding the new government together. It was a devil's bargain, struck in the dust of Kandahar and the valleys of Helmand province. We would look the other way on the poppies, and they would help us hunt the Taliban. The irony, of course, was that the Taliban, now regrouping as an insurgency, saw the very same opportunity. The poppy economy became the perfect fuel for asymmetric warfare. It required no complex infrastructure. It was drought-resistant, and it generated vast amounts of cash in a country that had very little else to offer the global market. The resurgent Taliban began to operate like a mafia. They didn't need to run all the fields themselves. They simply needed to control the ecosystem. They offered protection to farmers. They taxed the harvest. They taxed the traffickers who moved the raw opium paste from the fields to the labs. They taxed the labs that refined the opium into morphine base, and then into the final precious diacetylmorphine. Heroin number 4. Every step of the process, from the lancing of the poppy pod to the loading of the bricks onto a Toyota Hilux, generated revenue. A 10% tax here, a 20% tax there. It all added up. The scale of the resurgence was breathtaking. By 2007, just 6 years after the invasion, Afghanistan was producing 93% of the world's illicit opium. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported that the value of the opium exports had reached $4 billion a year, equivalent to more than half the country's official GDP. The poppy fields bloomed across the south, a sea of delicate petals, white, pink, and red, that represented a tide of misery for the rest of the world. Helmand province alone produced more opium than the entire country of Burma, the former global leader. The logistics of moving this product were as old as the Silk Road itself. The primary channel became known as the Balkan route. Convoys of trucks and pack animals would move the heroin west, out of Afghanistan and into the porous borders of Iran and Pakistan. From there it was consolidated, trafficked through Turkey, a historic crossroads for smuggling, and into the Balkans. In Albania and Kosovo, criminal organisations would prepare it for its final distribution into the lucrative markets of Western Europe. Ton after ton of high-purity, low-cost heroin washed over the continent. Purity levels in cities like London and Berlin, which had hovered in the low double digits, began to climb to 40, 50, even 60%. The price collapsed. A drug that had been expensive and relatively difficult to obtain became cheap and ubiquitous. Another path, the northern route, snaked up into the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. From there it fed a burgeoning crisis within Russia itself, which soon had one of the highest per capita rates of heroin addiction in the world. A vast river of opiates, originating in the very country the West had occupied to ensure its own security, was now flowing out in all directions, creating instability and funding the very insurgency the soldiers were there to fight. The efforts to stop it were Sisyphean. Eradication teams, often composed of Afghan forces supported by American or British troops, would descend on a field. They would cut down the stalks, burn the harvest, but for every field they destroyed, 10 more would be planted over the next hill. The programs designed to encourage farmers to switch to alternative crops, saffron, pomegranates, were well-intentioned but ultimately futile. No legal crop could compete with the poppy. A farmer could earn 10 times more from a hectare of opium than he could from a hectare of wheat, and the local opium buyer would come to the farm paying cash and often provide the seed and fertilizer on credit. The government, in contrast, offered little support for legal crops. The choice, for a man trying to feed his family in one of the poorest places on earth, was not really a choice at all. The war on terror had become, in a very real sense, a war funded by drugs. The money from the poppy fields bought AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, and night vision goggles for the Taliban. It paid the salaries of their foot soldiers. It corrupted the new Afghan government from the village level all the way to the highest ministries in Kabul. The very foundations of the state we were trying to build were being dissolved by the profits from the flour we had decided not to destroy. Afghanistan had become the world's first true narco-state, a nation whose economy and political life were wholly dependent on a single, illicit plant. And all of this happened under the watchful eye of the most sophisticated military and intelligence apparatus the world had ever known. A quiet, tragic, and utterly predictable failure, blooming in plain sight. This superabundance of potent, cheap heroin created a global user base with unprecedentedly high tolerances. The market was saturated. The addicts were primed for the next step, for something stronger, something cheaper, something synthetic, and a dark shadow was beginning to fall across North America, a shadow born not in a field of flowers, but in the cold, sterile logic of a chemical laboratory. The transition was not a sudden event. It was a quiet replacement, a chemical coup that took place in unmarked bags and dirty spoons. For years, the story of heroin in North America had been a story of two primary sources, the black tar heroin from Mexico and the white powder heroin, known as China White, that trickled in from Southeast and Southwest Asia. But the economics of the drug trade, like any other business, are governed by risk and profit. And producing heroin is a risky, inefficient business. It requires land, it requires a specific climate, it requires a large, compliant labour force to harvest the opium gum. The supply chain is long, vulnerable, and subject to the whims of weather and law enforcement. Then came fentanyl. It was not a new substance. It had been synthesised back in 1959 by the brilliant Belgian chemist Paul Janssen. For decades it had been a respected, if incredibly potent medical tool. A powerful anaesthetic used in operating rooms and a painkiller for cancer patients, delivered through transdermal patches. It was 100 times more potent than morphine, 50 times more potent than pure heroin. A godsend for those in agony, a monster lurking in the pharmacopoeia. The shift began when chemists, working for criminal organisations, realised the immense economic potential of producing fentanyl illicitly. It required no farms, no peasants, no seasons. All it required were the right precursor chemicals, a skilled chemist, and a laboratory. The precursors, for the most part, were legally produced and easily obtained from the vast, loosely regulated chemical industry in China. Shipped in barrels and falsely labelled as industrial solvents or pigments, they would arrive at ports in Mexico. There, in superlabs run by the Sinaloa cartel and the cartel Jalisco New Generation, the synthesis would take place. The logic was brutal and undeniable. A kilogram of heroin might cost $5,000 to produce in Mexico. That kilogram could be sold wholesale in the United States for perhaps $80,000. A stunning profit margin. But a kilogram of pure fentanyl, which could be produced for even less, was so potent that it could be used to create the equivalent of 50 kilograms of street-level product. The potential profit wasn't just greater, it was exponentially, astronomically greater. A single kilogram of fentanyl contained enough lethal doses to kill 500,000 people. The risk of smuggling also decreased. Instead of moving bulky bricks of heroin across the border, traffickers could now move a substance that was just as profitable in a package the size of a small bag of sugar. At first, the fentanyl was used as a cutting agent, a booster. Dealers would mix a small amount into their heroin supply to increase its potency and stretch their product. A user, accustomed to a certain dose of heroin, would inject what they thought was their normal amount. But the bag was hot, it contained fentanyl, and the difference was catastrophic. A few extra micrograms, an amount invisible to the naked eye, a few grains of salt's worth, was the difference between the familiar euphoric rush and immediate respiratory depression. The user would feel the initial warmth and then nothing. breathing would slow, it would become shallow, and then it would stop. The overdose numbers began to climb at a rate that stunned public health officials. What had been a chronic, simmering crisis became an acute, explosive catastrophe. In 2013 in the United States, there were just over 8,000 deaths from heroin overdose, and a little over 3,000 from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. By 2017, the heroin deaths had doubled to over 16,000, but the deaths from synthetic opioids had skyrocketed nearly tenfold, to almost 30,000. By 2021, the number would exceed 70,000. It was a quiet, relentless chemical warfare being waged on the streets of America. It wasn't a choice for the users. The market simply changed beneath their feet. The substance they sought, the familiar brown or white powder, was no longer what it claimed to be. It was a Trojan horse. Heroin became the delivery system for fentanyl. Soon the cartels realized they didn't even need the heroin. They could press fentanyl into pills, expertly mimicking prescription opioids like OxyContin or Xanax. A teenager buying a single pill from a friend or on social media, thinking they were experimenting with a pharmaceutical, was in fact taking a dose of illicit fentanyl that could stop their heart. The problem grew even darker with the emergence of fentanyl analogues. These were slightly modified chemical cousins of fentanyl, often created by chemists to skirt specific chemical bans. Compounds like acetylfentanyl, furanil, fentanyl, and the most terrifying of all, carfentanil. Carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer. It is 10,000 times more potent than morphine, 100 times more potent than fentanyl itself. A single microgram, a speck barely visible, could be lethal. When carfentanil began to appear in the street drug supply, even the most hardened users were terrified. Overdoses became almost instantaneous and incredibly difficult to reverse. The first responders, the paramedics, the firefighters, the police officers, were on the front lines of this new plague. They would arrive at scenes of unimaginable stillness. A man slumped over the wheel of his car at a green light. A young couple collapsed in the bathroom of a gas station. A group of friends, all dead in a single room, having shared the same contaminated batch. These scenes repeated themselves daily in small towns and large cities, from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. The morgues filled up. The coroners fell behind. The sheer scale of the death was difficult to comprehend because it was so quiet, so private, happening behind closed doors. It wasn't a single dramatic event, but a million tiny, isolated tragedies accumulating into a national trauma. The fentanyl shadow had completely eclipsed the old world of heroin. The poppy fields of Afghanistan and Mexico, which had for so long been the source of the problem, were now almost secondary. The threat was no longer agricultural, it was industrial. It was synthesized in labs, trafficked with the efficiency of a multinational corporation, and distributed with lethal indifference. The miracle drug had always been a liar, but its final synthetic evolution was its most deceitful and deadliest trick of all. A trick that left behind a legacy of ruin so profound that the world is still struggling to even measure its depths, let alone begin the work of recovery. The weight of this history is measured not in tons of seized narcotics or in billions of dollars of profit, but in absences. An empty chair at the dinner table, a child's room left untouched for years, a voice on an old voicemail that will never be heard again. The legacy of heroin, and now fentanyl, is a story of subtraction, of lives cut short and futures erased. The sheer scale of the loss is staggering. A slow-motion disaster that has hollowed out communities and left a scar across generations. For every overdose statistic, there is a sprawling network of grief, a family fractured, a circle of friends left wondering what they could have done differently. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming darkness, a quiet and determined response has been taking shape. It is a response born not of moral judgment, but of sheer pragmatism and a desperate will to keep people alive. It is the philosophy of harm reduction. If you cannot, in the short term, stop people from using a dangerous substance, you can at least take steps to reduce the immediate harm that substance can cause. It is a tacit admission that the war on drugs, with its focus on punishment and supply interdiction, has failed to protect the most vulnerable. The most powerful tool in this new arsenal is a medication called naloxone, most commonly known by its brand name Narcan. It is, in essence, an antidote. An opioid overdose occurs because the drug molecules bind to receptors in the brainstem that control respiration. The drug whispers to the body to stop breathing. Naloxone works by brute force. It has a stronger affinity for those opioid receptors than heroin or fentanyl does. When administered, usually as a nasal spray, it rips the opioid molecules off the receptors and takes their place. It blocks their effect. The results are astonishingly fast and dramatic. A person who is blue, breathless, and seconds from death can be jolted back to consciousness in under a minute, gasping for air as if surfacing from deep water. For decades, naloxone was a tool used only by paramedics and emergency room doctors. But as the fentanyl crisis accelerated, a movement began to put this life-saving drug into the hands of everyone. Police officers began to carry it, librarians were trained to use it, and most importantly, it was distributed to drug users themselves and to their families. The person most likely to witness an overdose is another person who uses drugs. Empowering them to save a friend's life is perhaps the purest form of harm reduction. It is a simple chemical intervention that says, your life is worth saving right now, in this moment, regardless of the choices that led you here. Another pillar of this pragmatic approach is the establishment of supervised consumption sites, or safe injection sites. The concept is straightforward and to some controversial. It provides a clean, safe, monitored space where people can use pre-obtained illicit drugs under the supervision of trained medical staff. They are given sterile injection equipment, reducing the transmission of HIV and hepatitis C. And if they overdose, which they sometimes do, nurses are there with oxygen and naloxone to immediately intervene. No one has ever died of an overdose in a sanctioned, supervised consumption site anywhere in the world. The oldest of these, Insight in Vancouver, Canada, has reversed thousands of overdoses since it opened in 2003. These sites are not a solution to addiction itself. They are a solution to death. They are a bridge, a point of contact where a person living in the chaos of addiction can connect with healthcare professionals, social workers, and treatment options, perhaps for the first time. They are a doorway out of the alley. Beyond these immediate life-saving interventions lies the long, difficult road of recovery. Here too science has offered new hope. For many, the most effective path forward is medication-assisted treatment, or MIT. This involves the use of long-acting opioids like methadone or buprenorphine to manage the physical aspects of addiction. These are not simply substituting one drug for another. Methadone, used since the 1960s, and the more modern buprenorphine, often combined with naloxone in a formulation called Suboxone, work by occupying the same receptors in the brain that heroin does, but they do so slowly and for a long duration. They do not produce the intense, euphoric rush. Instead, they eliminate the brutal, agonizing symptoms of withdrawal and quell the incessant, overwhelming cravings that so often lead to relapse. By stabilizing the brain's chemistry, these medications give a person the chance to rebuild their life. They can hold a job. They can repair relationships. They can engage in therapy and counseling to address the underlying trauma or mental health issues that may have driven their substance use in the first place. MAT provides a platform of stability from which a person can begin the psychological work of recovery. Yet, despite its proven effectiveness, access remains a huge challenge. There are not enough clinics, not enough doctors willing to prescribe it, and a deep-seated stigma persists, a belief that true recovery must involve complete abstinence, that using medication is a crutch or a cop-out. It is a moral judgment that has no place in medicine, a prejudice that costs lives. The history of heroin is a story of deception, a miracle of medicine that became a tool of social control, a cash crop for revolutionaries, and a synthetic plague for a new century. It has left a legacy of ruin that will take generations to mend. The fight against it is no longer a simple war to be won, but a complex, chronic condition to be managed. It is being fought not just by police and border agents, but by scientists in labs, by social workers and community clinics, by parents who carry Narcan in their purses, and by individuals who, every single day, make the quiet, courageous choice to fight for their own recovery. There is no final victory in this story, no easy end to the long night. There is only the slow, difficult work of undoing the damage, of saving one life at a time, of trying to coax a little light back into the immense shadow cast by the poppy and the laboratory. The miracle that deceived the world has taught us a hard lesson, that some miracles come with a cost far too high to bear, and the quiet work of healing is perhaps the only true miracle we have left.